So thank you all very much for coming. You're very fortunate in the two people you have on the stage. In particular, we have Naoko Ishii, who is the CEO of the GEF, the Global Environmental Facility. And myself, Nick Stern, I'm Professor of Economics at the London School of Economics and President of the British Academy. So, Naoko, we have two or three big issues. We have two or three big issues which we want to discuss. I particularly want to talk about the kinds of investments we will need and the kinds of growth we might get if we get sensible about tackling climate change and work to implement the Paris Agreement. But I'm keenly aware that climate is part of a big story. Climate is part of a big story about our relationship as consumers and producers and individuals, our relationship with ourselves and particularly with the environment in which we live. So that is a big story. If you like, it's about global commons. And I know that in the Global Environment Facility, that is where you're focusing. So shall we start by talking a bit about the global commons?
Thank you so much, Nick. Thank you so much for this opportunity. Yesterday, we were really at this historic moment that 2015 is a great year for SDG and climate COP. And something very, very new to these two historic agreements is that there is a clear recognition that the health of the planet, be it climate or the ocean, the forest or land or the water, is so essential for sustainable development. That is very, very clear from those two agreements. So that my interest is that how we can create the success that the climate change did for the up to Paris Agreement, how we can really learn from this process and how we can create this political, policy, social attention to those global environmental commons. As you rightly said, climate change is the very, very important system, but it's really the part of the entire planet system, so that if we ignore the other part of global commons, it will haunt us later. So I really would like to hear from you too, Nick, because that your Stern review of 2006 creates so much of the policy and the political attention to the climate change. You rightly pointed out that the global at the cost of inaction and the tragedy of commons. How, Nick, that you think now we can focus to create the same kind of political buzz on other important part of the global commons?
Thank you, Naoko. I think it's vital that we understand two things. One are the immense risks if we get it wrong. And we know, for example, in climate, that we're already 1 degree above the benchmark, which is the end of the 19th century. And that is the borderline of the Holocene period. That's the period where we grew up. We've been plus or minus 1, we're plus 1 now, and that Holocene period is the period where we cultivated grasses, we turned it into grain, so we had our civilizations where we had to sit and wait for the grain to come and guard the grain, and we had the surplus and we had the storage, and that's how we became who we are. It's very recent, 8,000 or 9,000 years, even though Homo sapiens, the hunter-gatherer, has been around for 250,000 years. So we have to understand the risks of going wrong. But even more important, I think, is we have to understand what we can do. And what we can do, and was underlining the agreement in Paris, underpinning the agreement in Paris, because we could see the alternative paths, that we could build cities where we can breathe, cities where we can move, cities which are productive. And that was absolutely critical. People have to see what you can do. When we made the agreement on the ozone layer, people could see how you could do without those substances that were causing the problem and how you could do it in a relatively cheap way. You can see the ways forward. When communities get together, for example, to reduce waste or to reduce their emissions, they find they can collaborate in other ways and create community shops and so on. So examples of what we can do at the global level, like the ozone layer and the Paris Agreement, at the local level when people get together for community energy schemes.
Thank you, Nick, for very concrete example and the way forward. In fact, one of the success of the climate agreement is that you, your group, and the leaders show that green growth is possible. So climate and green growth is these two can go together. So it's possible and it's actually beneficial or better for everybody. I think the success to the COP21 is actually that you convince the world that it's not only possible, it's actually better for everybody. I'm trying to see if this global environmental common story can tell the same kind of evidence, the stories and the example. So the investment in natural capital, be it ocean, the forest and land and the water, can we tell to the world that the investment in those natural capital is not only necessary for us to stay within these planetary boundaries, or not to go too deep in this Anthropocene that you mentioned from Holocene to Anthropocene, but also beneficial, and it's possible and beneficial. So that is actually the goal we really would like to work together.
There again, I think the examples are very clear. As you, for example, protect fishing, protect the fishery stocks, you find out that actually the fish bounce back fairly quickly, provided you do that protection. If you look at the rehabilitation of land, it can actually be done quite quickly. I remember standing on the Loess Plateau about a dozen years ago in China. You look one way and it's green, and you look the other way and it's desert. The difference was terracing, water harvesting, kicking the goats out. You know, this was the kind of way in which you could act together to change things. And if I could say something about the infrastructure investment story, because if you look at what we need to do to hold to well below 2 degrees, at least 2/3 of the emissions are associated with infrastructure and its use in some shape or form. If you look at the infrastructure that's coming, around 2/3 of it will be in emerging market and developing countries. Well, you multiply those 2/3 together, you get around a half. A half of what we have to do in order to achieve our target of well below 2 degrees is getting the infrastructure in the developing countries right. We will move in this next 35 years, from now to mid-century, to 3.5 billion people. Now, 50% of 7 billion in cities, to 6.5 billion, 70% of more than 9 billion in the middle of the century. That is a once in human history occurrence. If we get those cities and their infrastructure right, we can make an enormous difference to how we live. If we get it wrong, we'll be in deep trouble. We'll have unlivable cities, and we'll have locked in high carbons. And so getting that infrastructure investment moving is critical. You need good policies, because infrastructure is a long-term investment. Clear, credible policies, get rid of fossil fuel subsidies, price pollution and carbon, and regulate where necessary. At the same time, you've got to get the cost of capital down. Many people, Brazil, India, infrastructure projects face cost of capital 8, 9, 10% real rates. So you can bring that down by the involvement, the greater involvement in development banks, multilateral development banks, national development banks, the new Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, the new development bank, the BRICS Bank, expanding, and this is critical, the ability to lend of the existing multilateral banks. They bring down the cost of capital because they reduce risk by their presence. They can give equity and political risk guarantees in the early stages, which is so risky in infrastructure. And then, once it's stabilized and up and running, they can sell off to the pension funds who are looking for the long-term assets, and they can't see them, they shouldn't see them, in their traditional harbors, which was oil companies and so on. They ain't going to give good returns anymore. Those are very risky bets. But we have to realize the other infrastructure and make it non-risky. And that's how we can do it. And it's critical, and we have to move quickly.
Thank you, Nick. I think that when I see my portfolio of the GF, I can actually present to you a few good examples that how that public institution like us, or grant-making institution, can work with development banks and work with developing countries to make the entire infrastructure very sustainable, that pricing cost of that, to reducing the cost is one thing, but also to make the infrastructure sustainable. So it's a renewable energy, but also how to make the city planning is kind of integrated and a sustainable way. So that I think we have a huge opportunity here to work together, not only to cost, reduce the cost down, but also to integrate this sustainability, social environmental sustainability into this infrastructure planning.
Absolutely. Now, a very big part of that investment will be private sector investment, and we're seeing more and more the major private companies starting to see that the future is very risky if they do the old, bad, dirty ways, whereas actually the future is much more attractive and less risky for them as people seeking profits if they act more responsibly. So doing good is doing good business. And we're seeing a very powerful example of that now. I mean, Peabody Coal went bust because coal is so deeply polluting, and people realized that there's not much future in coal. That's an example of the ways in which people looking ahead see what's coming. And the more we're clear about the policies, the more the private sector will see that. Many of them are out ahead of government already, because they take a longer view and they realize that we're going to get there sometime. They're better off getting ready sooner rather than later. But clearer, stronger signals from government will make that process even stronger.
I cannot agree more. And for the last few days here, that we see the clear message from capital market that the more information, more transparency, more data, actually that can change the people's investors' mindset. And so we have seen that the kind of paradigm shift is coming to the capital market, which is really great news in my mind.
Now, we could talk to each other all day, and I would like to, but it's time to see if anybody wants to ask some questions or intervene. Questions? It's all blindingly obvious, or no?
Sorry, how would we get the cities more creditworthy? Because one of the main obstacles to city infrastructure financials of the future is that they are poorly creditworthy in the international markets.
So I don't know if everybody heard it. The question was how you get cities which are creditworthy. Now, people advance credit against confidence in the income that the entity that's borrowing has. So if you want to borrow for your house, the people lending to you will want to look at your income. So people lending to cities will want to look at the city income. So a key element in creditworthy cities is reliable local taxation. That's something, for example, that China is seeing very strongly now. It's not the only place, but it's looking very closely at that challenge. So local taxation, either in terms of taxing of land and buildings, or piggybacking on national income taxes, or piggybacking on VAT-like structures. So I know it all sounds nerdy, and you know, doing public finance can sound nerdy. But reliable sources of income are critical, and to some extent, the state standing behind them. Now, you can't have too much state standing behind them, otherwise you get irresponsible borrowing. So that's a fine balance to get it right. But I would start with the really strong, credible sources of local income, including congestion charges, for example.
If I may join Nick. One remarkable thing at Periscope is this clear increasing recognition that the role of the cities can play in fight against climate change, but also fight for SDG, Sustainable Development Goals. It's really, really remarkable. 700 mayors come together on this Paris City Hall to kind of show their, demonstrate their commitment and willingness to fight. And we actually, the international community, also create a kind of platform to help city mayors, planners, to do their planning right. Integrated, more socially, economically, environmentally sustainable planning, so that then we also GF together with other MDBs to create this platform. But one of the beauty of that platform is the city also wants to learn from each other, and how to do this sustainable planning more, how they can learn from each other. And through that, and a part of that platform, there is one component to actually address that, and one thing you mentioned, that how to enhance the credibility or enhance the credit worthiness of those cities.
It's incredible how they can drive down costs by, common standards. If they say all the buses that we're going to buy have got to meet these standards, if enough cities make that statement, you find that the cost of those buses goes down very quickly. So it's not just the revenue side, it's also the cost side where they can learn from each other and act together.
And also the World Bank, in some sense, to give direct access to cities like Jakarta or Anna, which are usually struggling on the private finance market. They look for public funding, but they must go through the national channel. But would you be prepared to direct access to cities?
Actually, one of GEF's flagship program, which I initiated for the last 2 years, is actually Sustainable City Program. Here, GF wanna do more direct business with cities. That's how this program is created. And we started with 24 cities along the world, across the globe, including, say, the 3 cities in Africa, Dakar, Abidjan, and Johannesburg, so that we are in direct conversation with mayors, how the institution like GF and other MDB can directly help the mayors to do their integrated and planning, and then with some kind of investment from MDB as a part of this sustainable integrated planning.
It's very important to look at the abilities of the new banks to lend in different ways. I was chief economist of the World Bank and of the EBRD, the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. Now, they're different kinds of entities doing different kinds of jobs, but the World Bank needs a sovereign guarantee. And that makes it more difficult to, it's not impossible, but it makes it a bit more complicated to lend at a lower level. On the other hand, the EBRD, the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, has all kinds of private sector loans, equity, guarantees, mezzanine, flexible structures, and it doesn't need a sovereign guarantee. The newer banks, I think, are moving in that direction. The Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank, the New Development Bank. So I think it's important as we expand, as we must, as I said, if we're going to get that infrastructure investment going, as we expand what the existing development banks are doing and add new ones as has happened, the way in which we do that expansion is very important. So they need, as it were, the instruments that will allow them to do exactly the kind of thing that you suggested.
That establishing your framework being the global commons, and that climate change, I took it you to say, was contained within the larger planetary commons idea. And then you talked about the 2 vital things, the second one being what we can do, and within that, examples of what we can do to spur further things on. Could you give us some examples of people acting with a mind towards the global commons successfully, for examples that would be encouraging?
I mean, we'll go to and fro, but the ozone layer is the agreement around protecting the ozone layer, which was actually clearly an international agreement, quite successful because the holes in the ozone layer are closing, but it was in large measure an understanding of the seriousness of the problem. That was the first thing. That was the foundation. But what opened the door, as it were, was an understanding how you could do without the CBCs, do without the things that were causing the problem. And as soon as you pose the challenge, the technical progress comes through very rapidly. So a second example would be the very rapid technical progress which we now see around electric vehicles, storage, drop in the price of solar panels and so on. Why did that come about? It came about because there was a big recognition of the severity of the challenge of climate change, and it moved up the research and development and the innovation agenda. So one was a very specific agreement. You could do fisheries as well. But one was a very specific agreement around the ozone layer. But the other is a more general thing, asking why the technical progress has moved so rapidly. Now, when I published the Stern Review 10 years ago, I would never have believed that most of the serious car manufacturers would be making electric cars. Who would have dreamt of the Tesla then? Who would have thought that the price of a solar panel would be 1/10, 90% lower than 10 years ago? It came from a recognition of the problem of the global commons here, climate, and this was the way we had to go. So there's some very general examples like that which are important, but there's also the specifics.
If I may join Nick with one more example, it's actually forest. As Nick said, if we invest in those natural capital, say forest, it actually grows, tree grows. So it's a very good investment. That it's an investment in natural capital appreciates, for the physical infrastructure depreciates. So we need to seize the opportunity to invest more in natural capital. In case of the forest, that we all know the agriculture system needs to also change. That's one of the key messages from new climate economy report. We need to find a way that the energy and the cities and the food production system, so that the food production is definitely one of them. In fact, 25% of the GHG emission come from this agriculture, including change or deforestation. So, but I can see that some momentum coming in. For instance, consumer goods forum. Now that the consumer are talking about how my shampoo or that consumer goods are kind of actually forces of the deforestation. So there is a coalition among consumers that how the consumer, being a consumer, can arrest the deforestation. So that then I can see those kind of supply chain approach and get involved the consumer as a responsible citizen to arrest that deforestation. Soybeans is another example. I just came back from Brazil, and the amazing thing I hear is that maybe China is kind of interested in buying only certified soy. It has a huge impact on the produce of the soybeans. So local farmers come together to to find a way to make their soy production more sustainable, so that for beans, soy, the palm oil, the paper, and the cattle, we can see that how we can actually appeal to citizens, that the consumers or the suppliers, to create that kind of notion that we are all involved in this investment in natural capital and invest in the global commons.
May I ask a clarifying question? Are you saying that visualizing, seeing clearly the food supply chain is what drives the consumer choice changes, similar to what you're saying? Is that
I think that without appealing that the consumers who are at the end of this supply chain, we can't really make a big success, because Nick is talking about the business bottom line, that how the business really see this change in the paradigm. At the end of the day, this end of the supply chain is consumers, the citizens. So unless we really appeal them that you are the part of this global commons agenda, we can't really make a big success.
Yeah, and we're right at the end of our time, but consumers need information. If you are told that you can be sure that this carpet is not made with child labor, and somebody else cannot show that their carpet is not made with child labor, that for many of us would tilt our buying decision. Many of us buy fair trade tea or coffee, and in particular, many people now want to know how dirty their product is, for example, in terms of its carbon content. And energy efficiency classifications on appliances can be very powerful. Learning more about your motor car assuming people are telling you the truth about your motor car, can make a very big difference. If you are investing in your pension, many of us would want to know that the people investing our money are investing in projects which are not dirty, because A, they should not do dirty projects, and B, that's going to be very risky, because that's not the way to give you a secure future for your money. So I think we're going to see much more information on all this, including Mike Bloomberg's task force for the Financial Stability Board at the request of Mark Carney, the chair of that board, the governor of the Bank of England. You're going to see much more information on all sides, including on financial products. That is time out. Thank you all very much for coming. Any last word from you, Naoko?
No, all of you can be a steward for the global commons. So I very much count on you, including Nick, your leadership, that let's safeguard our health of the planet for future generations. Thank you.
Thank you very much for coming. Thank you. Thank you.